All right, America, if you care about the future of the post office, then we need to come together and stand with our letter carriers and demanding transparency in their current contract negotiations because things aren't looking good. Now, if you haven't been paying much attention since Louis Dejoy was installed as Postmaster General, then you might not realize how bad things have gotten. And after the massive success of last year's open union negotiations, the leadership of the National Association of Letter Carriers has been uncomfortably secretive about how things are going, despite being in negotiations for over a year now. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised since the president still hasn't publicly apologized to the membership for abandoning negotiations for months to go to rehab. And it's hard to believe that there's an effective adversary to management when Dejoy was spotted at the union's Christmas party. Then again, this is the same union political dynasty that essentially fought to keep Dejoy in power, claiming that his efforts to disrupt mail-in voting were simply overheated speculations from the media. Unfortunately, the union is currently facing an identity crisis, with newly revealed documents showing that the national officers must have had ample knowledge of Brian Renfro's long battle with alcohol addiction, but pushed for him to be president anyway. Their actions hurt not only the union, but the labor movement as a whole. And considering that the survival of the Postal Service may be at stake, it's time for the public to stand up in solidarity with our rank-and-file postal employees, especially considering that it's illegal for them to strike. They put themselves at risk during the height of the pandemic so that we could vote safely, and they make voting by mail possible. And this election is vitally important. So I think it would be beneficial to workers nationwide if we help our carriers get a good contract by joining them in demands for transparency. But to make the most of this moment and to highlight the urgent need for public action, I need to take a moment to explain how the union got here, because this internal crisis is the culmination of a 70-year history of corruption in the NELC's leadership, behavior that was enabled in large part thanks to Brett Kavanaugh. Now, this is a very personal story to me, and while I've never been a letter carrier, my father was, and the NELC played a very large role in my life. My name is Zach Noble. I'm the son of David Noble, whose clean sweep slate ran against the incumbent officers in 2022. One of my earliest memories is of our garage being burned down in the middle of the night after CNN had ran their story on my father's whistleblower lawsuit, which exposed various secret payments that the union's officers were making to themselves. I was 4 at the time, our phone line had been cut, and the FBI was talking to my father in person before the night was through. It wasn't until I was older that I learned about the threatening voicemails that we were receiving. I'm here today because I feel it's important that I personally attest to the violence we faced and lend my credibility to this story, part of an extended effort that has won me an award from Whistleblowers of America. The record paints a striking picture that shows the danger of allowing the officers to continue to negotiate with Dejoy in secret. While there were various secret payments that my father exposed, the in-town expense allowance is the longest running scam. As noted in the relevant decisions, the $500 a month in-town expense allowance has existed since the 50s. To put that in perspective, in 1955, the average letter carrier only made $360 a month before tax. The union's constitution already provided for reimbursement of all itemized expenses, but for some reason the officers believed that they needed this $500 monthly in-town expense allowance, which made it so that they didn't need to provide receipts. As noted by the courts, the NELC's presidents have twice misleadingly denied the existence of this allowance, in 1976 and 1986 respectively. Further, there's evidence that this allowance is still being abused today, as the union's LM2 tax forms show that the officers spent nearly $50,000 on in-town entertainment expenses in 2020, even though DC was locked down for most of that year. So how did this continue for more than half a century? Well, this is where things get weird. In 2018, after nearly 25 years in court, we received the final decision for my father's whistleblower lawsuit during the middle of the union's national convention. The decision ended by finding that over the course of the entire lawsuit, my father had failed to adduce any evidence of wrongdoing by the defendants, a statement that was announced multiple times to the 10,000 delegates at the convention. Now, I hope that the idea of a lawsuit lasting almost 25 years without any evidence just sounds silly, especially after what I've just discussed. But what makes this truly odd is that we had been through all of this before. 10 years earlier in 2008, the same appeals court reversed the district's court dismissal of our case for this exact same contention, that there was no evidence. They went so far as to suggest that the district court may not understand what is required to establish proof, finding that my father had presented about as much evidence as an appellant could hope for. So somehow, as much evidence as one could hope for turned into never having any evidence ever. Even the 2018 decision recounts how 10 years earlier the district court's dismissal was overturned because there was ample evidence of misuse of funds, despite ending the decision by saying there had never been any evidence. So what happened here? Well, this brings us to Brett Kavanaugh. In 2008, Brett was one of 3 judges involved in our appeal of the district court's dismissal. He believed that the case should be dismissed entirely, whereas a judge named Williams thought that my father was right about everything. And the 3rd judge, Santel, sided with Kavanaugh on half the issues and Williams on the rest. As a result, the majority for the 2008 decision shifts or changes depending on which issue is being addressed. And I bring this up because the 2018 panel spends more time quoting Kavanaugh's separate opinion than the majority. And while they label Kavanaugh's opinion as both concurring and dissenting, the only surviving issues at this point were those he dissented on. So given the no evidence line, it starts to feel like the 2018 panel was trying to quietly adopt Kavanaugh's dissent without acknowledging how big of a 180 they had just pulled. And it's worth noting that this dissent made it into People for the American Way's list of dissents that paint Kavanaugh as a narrow-minded and out-of-touch elitist. Which is ironic because it mirrors the same thought-terminating, cliche-inspired approach that the union's leadership has pushed, that these issues have already been decided by the membership. And it's true that the union's leadership assigned an investigatory committee to research my father's charges and presented them to a special convention where they were voted down. But as Judge Williams points out as a member of the majority on this issue, Kavanaugh's belief that courts have essentially no role after convention delegates have approved officers' past behavior contradicts both the language and the purpose of the LMRDA, law that was passed specifically to protect against misuse of union funds by corrupt union officials. And while it fits certain agendas to treat the convention's vote as unquestionable, the people pushing those views conveniently ignore the glaring issues with how things were handled. Like how the investigating committee refused to let my father take part in their investigation or get a copy of their findings before the special convention. Or as noted by labor notes, how members were forced to stand and be photographed if they wanted to vote to uphold the charges. And let's not forget that one member of the investigation committee suggested that the whole committee should be disbanded and replaced after another member essentially bragged about being chosen to rig the investigation. But unfortunately, in the end, Kavanaugh's vision prevailed. Williams put a lot of effort into explaining why Kavanaugh was wrong, but as we've seen too often with our current Supreme Court justices, his panel mates simply chose to ignore his arguments. So while Williams was able to save the case by siding with Senthel and finding that there had been as much evidence as one could hope for in regards to the in-town expense allowance, he was clearly disgusted that the other issues had been dismissed, ending the decision by finding that, thanks to this court's decision, pilfering Union chieftains should sleep more easily tonight. And look how well they've slept. Asleep at the wheel during one of the most important contract negotiations this union has ever seen, all thanks to a drunk and his enablers. So given the very well documented history of corruption and deception, I hope you can understand why I'm sounding the alarm. I do not share my story of arson and violence lightly. Dejoy and these con artists masquerading as union leaders are a deadly combo. Open negotiations are the only thing that can give the membership the power to push back and fight for a contract that'll ensure the survival of this public institution. So please, share, sign, and stand with our letter carriers in demanding transparency. The Postal Service may depend on it.